Welcome to All Pro Football Data. My name is Jim Coburn, and today's episode we're talking about the Las Vegas Raiders 2024 NFL backfield based on data. So we're going to look at the production, athleticism, and other statistical factors to determine who, if anybody, should be invested in long term in the Raiders in 2024 for fantasy football purposes or for just fan purposes of the Raiders. Stay tuned until the end of the video where we reveal who is probably or what the scenarios are going to be for the starters at the running back position for the Raiders this year. We'll follow that stuff out of the way. So this is the setup for the Raiders this year. The Las Vegas Raiders lost former first round running back Josh Jacobs to free agency based on his overall market share data. So taking a look at the market share of his touches, his yardage, touchdowns, in every single respect, he has dominated. So Jacobs has dominated touches throughout his career on the Raiders with a high 80 to 90 plus percentile finishes compared to the rest of the NFL since 1994, which leaves a massive power vacuum to be filled by the Raiders' backfield. So just taking a look at the list. So again, these are all the running backs that have had really any significant starts or production in that time span. And the closest running back was DeAndre Washington in 2019. That's the closest back that's come to kind of taking away touches from Josh Jacobs. So with his absence, what is the future of the Raiders backfield going to look like? And that's what this video is going to get into, is that aspect of things. With that setup done, the Raiders have a variety of contenders for the starting spot, including former fourth rounder Zamir White. So he's kind of the favorite. He's currently number one on the depth chart right now. But they also had a free agency addition in Alexander Madison, former Minnesota Viking. There also is a career backup in Amir Abdullah, who is a pretty solid, efficient back, which we're going to get to some of his data later on as well. And a new sixth round selection in Dylan Labbe from New Hampshire, who also has some interesting data with him. But these are the running backs most likely to have a shot at becoming the Raiders' top back. So with that information, let's look at how they stack up based on their pre-draft profile. And then after we look at their pre-draft profile, how they tested in college, we're going to take a look at their NFL profiles, or at least how they produced in the NFL, with the exception of Dylan, because Dylan hasn't played in the NFL yet. But we're going to take a look at the ones that have actually already done production at the NFL level based on data. So let's get to it. So starting off with offensive market share production scores, taking a look at Zamir White, his total offensive market share has not been that fantastic. He had a 44 percentile total offensive market share score, 13 percentile in terms of receiving market share, and then 71 percentile in terms of touchdown market share. So he was very good in terms of getting touchdowns at Georgia, but not so hot in terms of his overall market share and receiving market share there. When you take a look at his efficiency scores, this is the area where he did really well in terms of touchdown percentage, but his yards per touch and touchdowns per touch were all below average. So his efficiency really came down to getting touchdowns, not so much in terms of his yards per reception or yards per touch, which is a little bit concerning. Then when you look at his athleticism traits, he did have above average explosiveness and 91 percentile speed, which is good traits to have. So he had Pro Bowl level athleticism traits. But when you get to his adjusted production traits, so adjusted production takes a look at age, the MSA rating, and the pass rating. So it takes a look at the strength of schedule, strength of team compared. So when a lot of people go, well, he wasn't productive, but he played at Georgia. This is what this metric is looking at. And when you take a look at it, it's not where you want it to be. 56 percentile in terms of his age, 66 in terms of the MSA, and then 60.69 in terms of his pass score. So these are not the numbers that you want to hit at the position here. So that is a little bit of a concern for him. Now, when you get to the other running backs here, so taking a look at Alexander Madison, for example, his total offensive market share was in the 60 percentile range in terms of receiving, with 72 percentile in terms of touchdowns. And when you look at his efficiency scores, he actually was a little bit more efficient in terms of yards per touch, yards per reception, but not so much in terms of TD percentage. When you look at his athleticism traits, He had a very low speed score in terms of 41 percentile, with a flexibility score of 62 percentile and an explosion score of 87 percentile. So Madison's a more short area, kind of horizontal threat as a running back. So again, he's not going to outrun people, but he is going to be able to beat people to the hole, so to speak, in terms of his short area quickness and change of direction skills. So that's the big skill set that he has. But again, he's not the fastest running back. Then when you look at his adjusted production, his age was a little bit of a concern in addition to his MSA rating and pass rating. So again, these are not the numbers that you would expect or want your running back to hit, but not terrible either. He kind of tested like a career backup, and that's kind of what he's been for a lot of his career for the most part. So I wouldn't expect anything to change now that he's on the Raiders, but that's just kind of how his data shakes out. Then, of course, we get to another running back on this list in terms of uh, I think this guy in particular is Amir Abdullah. Great production again at the start for him. When you look at his efficiency scores, he did well in terms of touchdowns per touch, yards per reception, and yards per touch, which are all great numbers for him. And then when you look at athleticism traits, similar to Alexander Madison, very explosive, very flexible, but speed not really there for him. Not the best speed score. And adjusted production wise, he had probably the best adjusted production out of all the running backs on this list. But he's older now. He's past his prime. So again, even though he is a solid NFL running back now, in terms of to have on your roster, he's past his prime. He's not somebody I really see contending for the starting running back spot anytime soon because of his age. But he did have a great pre-draft profile, and it shows why he stayed in the NFL as long as he has because of that. And then the last running back to mention, probably the dark horse fan favorite, whatever you want to call it, every fantasy football owner's favorite guy to mention in terms of who to project, because every year there's going to be rookie wide receivers that people get a fever for. They got a fever, they got a feeling he's going to make it, he's going to make it. It's Dylan Lobby from New Hampshire. So this is what his production says about him. He had a good total offensive market share production score, good receiving market share. That's a big plus. It's a big plus, people. Pay attention to that. He was a great receiver at New Hampshire in terms of his production. Touchdown data was not the best, 76 percentile. His efficiency scores were a little off. His yards per touch wasn't the best. His yards per reception was well above average, and then TD percentage was above average. But again, these aren't blowing you out of the water numbers either. So that's the biggest concern is that these numbers were at New Hampshire. This wasn't at Georgia. This wasn't at some big time school. This was at New Hampshire. So that's kind of the concern here in terms of his efficiency scores. When you look at athleticism, though, good athleticism, 63 percentile in terms of explosiveness, 54 in terms of speed, but 88 percentile in terms of flexibility. The flexibility score is essentially the change of direction score. It takes into account the short shuttle, the three cone, those types of areas. So these are big positives for Dylan, very big positives for him. And it's not surprising that a lot of people would view him as a receiving back because he has a production from college to be a receiver, and he has the athleticism traits of a really good receiving back as well. So that's something to kind of look out for in him on this roster because he has all the traits you're looking for in terms of a solid NFL running back. Then, of course, you get to adjusted production traits in terms of his age, not the best. He's a little bit older. His MSA rating is not really there, and that's because of where he played. He played at New Hampshire. He didn't play at Georgia. He didn't play in the SEC. He didn't play in the Big Ten. He played at New Hampshire. And when you play at these smaller schools, you kind of have to overproduce compared to other players. Is this the biggest red flag ever? No. Again, he's a sixth rounder. But in terms of projecting him as a starter on this particular roster, it gets a little tougher because of his level of competition and the fact that he didn't dominate that level of competition in the way that you would want him to. So that's kind of the biggest concern with him when you look at his adjusted production traits. Taking a look at the NFL production. So now let's shift to the current backs on the roster for the Raiders in terms of their NFL production. So first we're going to look at rushing production, then we're going to look at receiving production. So taking a look at the backs in terms of rushing production. The top backs compared to all the backs on the team right now in terms of rushing has been Alexander Madison. He's had a much more consistent career in terms of getting yards, touchdowns, and first downs compared to Zamir White and Amir Abdullah. And I didn't go all the way back with Amir Abdullah. I just did him in the last 3 seasons to kind of keep it a little simple with him because he was much more productive as a younger running back, but he's not, again, he's much older now. So again, you have to take that into account to a certain extent. But Madison's been the best in terms of overall rushing production. Taking a look at the efficiency score, so this takes a look at yards before contact per attempt, yards after contact per attempt, and then attempts per broken tackle. So the more broken tackles you have, the better you'll score in this essentially. And taking a look at the data here, the best in terms of on efficiency, so how well they do on a per snap basis. The best in terms of rushing the football has been Amir Abdullah and Zamir White. Those have been the best running backs on this roster in terms of getting yak and also in terms of breaking tackles. So those are the big things to kind of look at here. So in terms of that does help White out a lot in terms of him as a rusher. Is that he hasn't been the most productive player, but when you've given him the football, he does get a lot of yards after contact, which is a good sign. So yards before contact is more of a offensive line score in many ways, whereas yak, again, that ability to get yards after contact is made is a much better sort of metric to look at in terms of efficiency. So that's where White really does well, and of course Amir Abdullah, even at age 30, has been doing well in that respect. So those are big positives right there. Then, of course, when you look at the rushing production in terms of the TD percentage, first down percentage, overall macro production, overall efficiency production, and the running back star score, which takes a look at overall rushing and efficiency, the top backs here have been Alexander Madison, Zamir White, and Amir Abdullah. So all three of those guys have been they've had the best data from that perspective. Now, Madison had kind of a down year in 2023, so 2022 was the year that he had better overall macro production and efficiency. But you can see the case being made that White might be that main rusher because he has decent first down percentages, decent running back macro and decent efficiency as we just saw. So there might be something there with him as a rusher to kind of keep track of. Then when we get to receiving production, so this takes a look at who the best receivers are right here, and Amir Abdullah has dominated that ranking from 2021. Madison as well has also done really well, but White, just as he hasn't been that great of a receiver coming out of college, hasn't really shown up much in terms of his NFL production. So that's something just to keep in mind is that Zamir White hasn't really shown to be a dual threat at the running back position. He's decent at rushing, but receiving and receptions is not exactly his forte. So that makes it sound like this is probably going to be more of a running back by committee situation here. Now, when you get to the efficiency in terms of receptions, Madison, Abdullah are the two main ones that have really done well in terms of their efficiency. So in terms of yards before contact per reception, yards after contact per reception, and attempts per broken tackle, they've done well in all those areas. Madison and Abdullah have done really well in those areas. So this makes it sound like there is that potential that maybe White might be the main rusher, and then Abdullah and Madison are sort of going to be sort of the receiving backs. That's kind of what this data says. Again, are they going to be great? That remains to be seen, but that's kind of how their data has been so far, with White being more so middle of the pack in terms of his ability there. So that's something to kind of keep track of as well. And then when you look at the receiving production data, so the quarterback rating, Alexander Madison has the highest quarterback rating given by a running back targeted in terms of the running backs that are on the roster right now. In fact, he has ranked uh, one, two, three, four times in the top five in terms of his ability to make his quarterback look good in some ways in terms of his production after the catch. TD percentage also is a little bit better with Madison, as well as first down percentage. And of course, you look at Zamir White is way down there in terms of his ability there as a receiver. So that's just something else to look at. Is that again, Abdullah and Madison are much better receivers, whereas White has not really done that as well. Now, in terms of the receiving production overall, interception percentage, macro production, and efficiency, again, Madison and Abdullah are the main ones that stick out here, whereas White is more so behind those guys in terms of that. So that is again the biggest concern, which is why this really looks more like a running back by committee situation, because Madison is not the best in terms of rushing. White is also not the best in terms of receiving. So what's the best of both worlds? You just have them do those duties separately. So that's kind of the biggest issue with this Raiders backfield in terms of projecting, is you have those issues there. Now, in terms of White's data comparison, so if we're gonna say, because White is on top of the depth chart right now, and we don't really have enough data to really project him as a starter just yet, let's take a look at what his data says about him in terms of his draft status and his data production. So what you're looking at right here is it takes a look at the data of all the running backs that has similar data score to Zamir White, who also had similar draft status to Zamir White. So draft status is, were they taken, 65th, or were they taken, in the 6th round, the 5th round, the 4th round, etc. And taking a look at the data here, White just, he's not really near the players that you want him to be in. So the closest comparison for White based on this data, which goes back to the 1969 NFL draft class, is Steve Worcester from Texas. So when you take a look at the receiving production, you take a look at the total offensive market share, the touchdown production, the TD percentage, the yards per reception, the yards per touch, all that stuff here, even the age, all that stuff, and in the round where they were selected, Worcester was taken in the 4th round that year, and Zamir White was taken in the 4th round. That is a little concerning. Roschon Johnson is there as well, but not quite the same. I know there is also Raymondre Stevenson, but he had much better production overall, especially in terms of efficiency. Carlos Williams has also been better in terms of efficiency, and Tony Pollard is a much better receiving back. In fact, that's kind of how he broke in to the Cowboys, is that he was such a good receiving back to kind of get more touches there. So this is a situation where I am a little concerned about Zamir White. So as much as we can look at his NFL production and make predictions, you also have to look at the historical outcomes. And when you look at this data for White, it's just not, it's not popping. It's not popping. There's two main backs in Stevenson and Pollard really has nothing to do with Zamir White in terms of his college production. And Stevenson also, to another extent, really has nothing to do with Zamir White as well. That kind of makes you pause a little bit, makes you a little scared for him. So it's not to say that he might start this year or be sort of a rotational committee guy, but it looks like he may not be the guy. Like, even though he is on top of the depth chart right now, I think there's other backs that might need to step in and take his spot because of what the historical data says about him. And then when you get to the Dillon comparison, so now we're looking at the comparisons for Dillon from New Hampshire. He's kind of in the middle here, right underneath Stump Mitchell from the Citadel. When you take a look at Dillon Lobby, he has not really the same or better outcomes per se. So when you look at guys like Justin Forsett, Ernest Biner is probably the best out of the group here, but Brock Olivo from Missouri, Stump Mitchell I just mentioned, of course. But as you can see here, not the best either in terms of comparisons here, but you do see a path. You do see a path for success here with Dillon. So as much as he is definitely a dark horse, definitely a long shot to a certain extent because of his overall data, when you look at the weaknesses here on the Raiders in terms of, having kind of a weak profile on Zamir White, weak profile on Alexander Madison, because again, he's not a full service running back. He has strengths and weaknesses. Amir Abdullah as well is a little bit older. He's a back who could do it all, but now he's older now, and he is efficient, but I don't really see him getting the majority of the carries either. So based on all this information, this is a mess. It could be a beautiful mess, but this is a little bit of a mess in terms of projecting here. So, as much as I like to be on the Dillon train, which could be great, and I think there is that potential he could be the starter here, but just because of how weak the overall Raiders running back group is, I still have my doubts. There's still some doubts here because when you look at the draft status data here, and you look at the sort of the comparables here as well. So that is a concern, and also the fact he played at New Hampshire. So overall, the Raiders' running back outlook. So I see four potential outcomes for the Raiders in 2024. The number one or pessimistic outlook. So this is the sort of objectively looking at the data, what is the sort of main takeaway here? And I think the main takeaway is that Zamir White emerges as the main rusher with Alexander Mattison taking the receiving duties. That's sort of the pessimistic sort of outcome route for it. And the reason why is Zamir White has not shown to be a great receiving back in college, nor has he shown to be a great receiving back at the NFL level. He is good at rushing. He does have that going for him. But because of that, they're going to have a back kind of do the receiving duties, get the receiving back duties. And I think Madison fits that bill a little bit better. Is he great? No, but he can fill that role. And I think that's kind of like the pessimistic look for this. Now, the faith-based outlook is that Dylan emerges as the main rusher and gets the majority of the touches. So this is a lot less likely to happen. This is more faith-based, which is based on just my faith in him as a player. Because again, there are some positives there. He has a really interesting athleticism profile. It's very similar to guys like Christian McCaffrey in terms of his athleticism. It has nothing to do with him being white. It's just his athleticism traits are like McCaffrey, are like LaShawn McCoy even, in terms of his data. And because of that, you could have that potential where he does well and athletically speaking. He has that freshness to him. He's younger than the running backs I just mentioned as well to a certain extent. So that freshness could push him up, and then eventually he gets the starting spot for him. That's definitely a possibility here. But what scares me about him is the fact that, again, the production was against lower level competition. He wasn't extremely efficient against that level of competition either. Again, when you look at his yards per reception, his yards per touch, they weren't where you want it to be for his level of competition. So again, that's concerning. So that's kind of the faith-based outlook one. So that's the rookie fever sort of outcome here. And honestly, if you are in a dynasty league, he might be worth a shot to kind of take, and maybe you get fire with him because there is that potential there. There is that sliver of a spark there that could make him great. The third option, which I think is more of a realistic option here, is that White emerges as the main rusher with Dylan getting receiving touches. So even though Alexander Mattison was brought in to be a receiving back for them, he's he's older. He hasn't really been the best. 2023 was not a great year for him. So his best years might be past. Running backs typically peak around age 26. So Madison is in that range where his best years might be behind him. And because of that, you might want to go with the rookie kind of getting the receiving touches and then White kind of getting the rushing touches, which is sort of a happy medium. It's not exactly what anybody wants, you would want a running back to be able to do what a Josh Jacobs does in terms of getting the receptions and getting the rushing yards. But I think that looks more realistic as that White emerges as the main rusher with Dylan getting the receiving touches because that's the biggest thing that he excelled at in college was his ability as a receiver. And the fourth option is that it's just a mess and all these running backs get touches and there's no real clear starter week to week, and that definitely is another option as well because this is not the strongest running back group. It really isn't. When you look at the data and you look at the talent that they have, there are some concerns. So that's going to be something to kind of look at there. I believe the Raiders' future running back might not be on the roster currently. However, so Dylan does offer the athleticism and maturity to make an instant impact as a rookie to become the future back. However, he's someone who you have to ignore the red flags on due to his draft status and his level of competition. It's just something you can't ignore. So as much as we can get excited about him and hope he does really well, which I hope he does. I hope he becomes what I think option two is what I really want him to do. Again, that's my sort of fanboy outcome I want to see. There is that concern. There is that sort of in terms of projection, it's that blind spot in the data that is a little concerning with him. So again, I'm excited about the Raiders' backfield. I think there are some talented running backs here. I want to see what Zamir White does. This is going to be the first year where he actually gets a good crack at the football, and he could be exceptional. He really could, based on his athleticism traits. Uh, Dylan could be really great as well. Madison and Abdullah, not as much. I mean, Abdullah again has a role on this team, sort of a backup rotational back, but he's a little past his prime. So that's kind of what you're looking at here with the Raiders backfield overall is kind of those four scenarios there. And I think me personally, I would love to see the number two option. I think number three is a little bit more realistic. But let me know in the comment section below, how do you feel about the Raiders backfield? Who is your choice for the starting running back this year? Who's going to get the most touches? Who's going to get the most rushing yards? All that kind of stuff. Let me know in the comment section below about that. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you love if you love the content I'm putting out and you want to see more like it, do that. If you have any suggestions for topics to cover in the future, also comment below about those suggestions. Thank you guys so much for watching. Check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/jcoburn. Check out my formerly known as Twitter account at Geometrics as well. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.